All right, at this time, it's always a good thing to go back and review some highlights of our history. And nobody better to do that than Dr. Rodney Hood. Dr. Hood is going to talk a little bit about the highlights of the history of the National Medical Association.
Michael, I remember that meeting.
NMA history.
Now, Dr. Michael Lenore has given me a tremendous task. I got 5 minutes to talk about 5,000 years of NMA history. Now, I know most of you thought the organization was 123 years old. So, outline. We're first going to briefly talk about the DNA of the NMA, going way back to ancient African medical history. Then we're going to talk about the early 19th century, which I call pre-NMA. And then the late 19th century are the beginnings of what we now see today as the NMA. And then we're going to talk about the 20th century and the 21st century. And since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to talk fast. So, why is history important? And I love this quote. I remember hearing Kanye West say, "When you hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. We spend too much time on the past and not enough time on the future." There's an old Sumerian proverb, "What became of the black-faced people of summer?" The traveler asked the old man. For ancient records show that the people of summer were black from the land of Cush. What happened to them? Ah, the old man sighed. They lost their history, so they died. Imhotep was a great African physician deified approximately 3,000 years ago. He was the first person known throughout the world that had knowledge and was talked about as being the god of medicine 5,000 years ago. Some 2,500 years ago, before the Greeks laid claim to this event. Today, we at the National Medical Association have adopted the oath of Imhotep, that all NMA presidents and attending physicians during the installation quote, and I'm going to read you the first line. "I swear by this oath in recognition of Imhotep, healer and physician of antiquity, with God as my witness, to uphold these lofty values to the best of my ability." And just to give you some idea, we always think that what we learn today came from the Eurocentric Western culture. This is the actual publication in Edinburgh Medical Journal in England, published in 1884. And Dr. Falcon was a British physician who witnessed cesarean sections being performed by a binaural surgeon in Uganda in 1879 with the use of aseptic techniques, sutures, and hot cautery iron. This operation had obviously been perfected and in use in Africa for centuries in order for the technique and low complication rate to be perfected. This was witnessed by Falcon, and this occurred 30 years before cesarean sections became commonplace in Europe, and when they did, high complication rates. So, in the book, An American Health Dilemma, Dr. Burton Clayton talked about the early 19th century, where they call it the first black health reconstruction. So after emancipation, the Freedmen's Bureau legislation resulted in the creation of unequal but separate health facilities. During this period, we saw an increase in access to health care. Blacks experienced improved health status. And this period ended with the institution of Jim Crow that severely restricted access to health care. During this period, we saw Harlem Hospital in New York City Cook County Providence Hospital in Chicago, Homer Phillips Hospital in St. Louis, Howard Medical School and the Freeman Hospital, Meharry Medical School and Hubbard Hospital, and many others where black doctors and patients had to receive the services. Separate but unequal. Now, organized medicine played a role in the formation of the National Medical Association. There are 3 time periods where African American physicians attempted to become part of the mainstream. The first, in 1869, 3 well-qualified black physicians, Dr. Augusta, Dr. Purvis, and Dr. Tucker, all 3 were refused membership in the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, which was the all-white AMA chapter in DC. Their rejection was supported by the National American Medical Association. These physicians, therefore, started a separate local chapter that was desegregated, and they called it the National Medical Society. In May of 1870, the 21st annual meeting of the AMA took place in Washington, D.C. This body of the National Medical Society attempted to get credentialed and was denied. Again, there was a convention in 1872, and a similar biracial delegation was denied acceptance to the AMA. And this was on the basis of the chair of the AMA Ethics Committee, Dr. Keller. It was an ethical reason why blacks could not become part of the AMA. As a result of that, the local Medical Chirurgical Society of the District of Columbia was formed in 1884, and this medical society would become one of the first constituents of the National Medical Association. So now in 1895, there was a great meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, the Cotton State and International Expedition in 1895. And if you remember, Booker T. Washington was there where he gave this great speech. There were many African American health professionals there who came to that convention. One of them was Dr. Robert Boyd, a leading physician in Nashville, Tennessee. He called together a total of 12 health professionals, most of them physicians, some pharmacists, some dentists, and they met at the First Congregational Church in Atlanta, Georgia. This is where the first time the National Medical Association was born. The original purpose of the National Medical Association, and I'm going to read this to you because the more I read it, I say this brother could write. Conceived in no spirit of racial exclusiveness, fostering no ethnic antagonism, but born of the exigencies of the American environment, the National Medical Association has for its object the banding together for mutual cooperation and helpfulness the men and women of African descent who are legally and honorably engaged in the practice of the cognate professions of medicine, surgery, pharmacy, and dentistry. And little note, if you ever notice the difference between the National Medical Association meetings and other professional meetings that you go to, we have family meetings. And not only could we not join the NMA, we could not get into convention centers and hotels. So the early conventions were usually at churches, and the local health professionals house their colleagues to stay with them. And as a result, they would bring their wives and their families. And today, we got one of the most confusing conventions, but one of the most wonderful conventions where we have 5 in 1. We have a business meeting with board and House of Delegates, scientific meeting for CMEs, auxiliary, the children's program, and because at that time, most of the doctors had graduated from Howard and Meharry, it was a social thing. And you still see that happening today. I got 2 minutes, thank you, madam. This was one of the pioneer founders of the NMA. He was actually the first vice president, a black pioneer by the name of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the first operation on the living human being, open heart, in 1893. Lynching was a leading cause of death in the early 21st century. In 1890s, lynching claimed an average of 139 lives per year. Between 1882 and 1968, an estimated 4,742 blacks met their death at the hands of lynch mobs. Now, why is this important? Because the NMA worked with the NAACP to get the U.S. Congress to pass an anti-lynching law, but was blocked by Congress. In 2005, the U.S. Congress met and gave an apology for this action, and it was attended by James Cameron, who was 91 years old but had survived a lynching in 1930. Now, this slide is personal. In 1957, the NMA joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Urban League, the Medkai Society, now an NMA affiliate, to sponsor the first Imhotep National Conference on Hospital Integration. And subsequently, they had annual meetings, and these meetings were instrumental in disseminating strategies to end segregation and discrimination. And what you see is a letter addressed to Gerald Hood, a cousin of mine in Georgia. And let me read it to you. He applied to Emory University Medical School in 1959. Acknowledgement is made of your letter of July 30th, enclosing your application for admission to our School of Medicine. I am sorry I must write you that we are not authorized to consider admission a member of the Negro race. I regret that we cannot help you. Yours truly, L.L. Cligg, Director of Admissions. P.S. We are going to return your $5 application fee. Now, what's ironic about this is some 40 years later, my daughter, Nidra Hood, actually matriculated through Emory in urology. Again, Burton Clayton talked about the second Black Reconstruction period after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. This time, the NMA criticized the AMA, who continually supported racial exclusion in the South. It eventually led to the AMA to begin to allow black physicians to join many of their societies. And this is an interesting picture. In the 20th century, Dr. Montague Cobb was the president of the NMA in 1964. He was also president of the NAACP. He and the National Medical Association strongly advocated for passage of the civil rights legislation that included Medicare and Medicaid. The NMA was the only professional medical organization that supported this legislation. So on August 14, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson attended and spoke at the NMA National Convention held in Houston, Texas, and thanked the NMA for its support. In this picture, you see President Ronald Swan, who was president in 1967, and then James Whitaker, who was president-elect in 1968. In the 21st century, the NMA continues to serve as the conscience of medicine within the U.S. health system. NMA is not afraid to speak truth to power because we always knew that many root causes of health disparities were a measure of health inequities, now referred to as social determinants and not physiological. In the 21st century, he's pulling me off, so these are two accomplishments. There were many more. I call it the National Medical Association inspired unequal treatment confronting racial and ethnic health disparities in healthcare. Now, the reason why I mention this is that our past president, Dr. Gary Dennis, in 1999, spent a lot of time with the Congressional Black Caucus and actually got the Congressional Black Caucus to push legislation to fund the IOM study for approximately $1 million. And then once when this was done, the IOM came to the NMA, asked us for recommendations to sit on that panel. And I think we recommended about 4 or 5, and at least 3 were on that panel. And for those of you who are not familiar, this IOM study's final report concluded that discrimination, racism, and physician bias contributed to differences in health status and outcomes for minority physicians. And oh, by the way, in 2008, the AMA finally apologized for their discrimination. And lastly, this is the signing of the White House when the National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities legislation was signed by William Clinton. We were very well represented in the White House, and if you look at this picture, there's at least 4 or 5 folks who were NMA members in this picture. Dr. Frank Royal is far left. And today, the struggle continues. Our current president, Dr. Doris Brown, with the urgency of now, creating a culture of health equity. Thank you.